Okay, welcome. We're going to try to continue to a second class, which is really a first class. Last time we just went through the preface, and hopefully we'll get some group together. I'll create some space to have continued discussions and get people on one page, see where you're up to. People should read for themselves, because listening is only preparation for reading and for thinking. But here I want to get into a second class and to get into the text itself slowly. So we'll try to start where we are. And the first thing I would have to say is it's going to be very slowly getting into where we want to get. And basically for the reason, like we've elaborated last time, this is not a book for beginners. It is a book that's methodically organized and starts from the beginnings of things, but it's not for beginners. So we could make a differentiation between writing the basics, starting a discipline, starting a subject from its basics, from its primary sources, from its original motivations for existing, for being, and a class or a book or a way of explanation, a way of teaching, which is directed at beginners as beginning people. And the main difference in this context is that beginners' books and beginners' lectures tend to dumb down the content, maybe dumb down is not the correct language, it's a derogatory term in some sense, but they tend to distill content into more manageable forms, into ways that can be held in mind without prerequisites, right? That's really a more correct term. They want to make things, and another way of saying it is without the two things that are the most important, and if we're speaking in terms of mental discipline and dedication to understanding anything, which is memory and dedication of time. In other words, if you want to study something, and this was one of the important things, if we remember, going back to the preface a second, what he said here, where he said is, don't expect me to say things twice. This not expecting me to say things twice is really defining that this is not a beginner's work. Because for beginners, and this is true to anyone that deals with beginners, and we're all beginners, of course, in many senses, it's all about repeating things twice. In other words, it's all about assuming that when you come to the second class, you forgot the first one. Another way of saying it was assuming that you don't have the context built up for actually grasping the depth of what we need. And this is something that I think about a lot, and since the way I teach tends to be somewhat cut off week by week, it's a very important thing to think about and maybe to struggle with. Again, to give beginners things really means to not only to dumb down the things, which of course has its space, because you want to bring people in, you want to give them a taste of it and sort of bribe them into believing that this is interesting, to advertise it, right? We'll give you a, how's it called when you go to the grocery and they give you a tasting of something, right? In the hopes that you'll buy it. So that's one kind of beginners class or tasting. But more, what really bothers me, and the reason why, like I've said last time, we do not do beginners things, is because it tends to always, the moral reason is because it tends to always talk down to the audience. And I want to define a little bit what this exactly means. Because if you're reading a beginner's book, it's always assuming that you don't know, and of course it's true, because I don't know, I'm just starting to learn, how would I know anything? But the thing is that in the second page, it assumes that you don't know the first page, or the first chapter. And chapters, of course, can be construed more broadly, the chapter or the concept or the previous book that you're supposed to read and so on. Another way of saying this would be to say, I think I'm saying a bunch of things at once. Another way of saying this would be to say, beginner's style things always need to be self-contained. So if I'm giving a class today, it needs to be self-contained in today, and there can't be something that needs some sort of elaboration or some sort of given a certain interpretation that I do not have time and I can't tell you all at once. So I'm going to have to rely that you already understand, not to take this in the wrong way, as I've explained yesterday, or I will explain next week or next month or next year. So and therefore, beginners classes, they're not only, although people would assume sometimes that they're giving you stepping stones, they have something inherent to them that they never let you actually get to it. So when I say they talk down to you, they don't only talk down to you, they sort of leave you stuck in a certain beginner's level or pre-beginner's level, because they cannot trust you enough to have built up the context. And most deep thought is really all about building up context, and there's studies about this, and long-term memory and short-term memory, and exactly at what level these things will have to happen. But in order to understand anything slightly more complicated than very basic and simple things, you need to be able to sort of, like in the computer language, load into your memory a whole bunch of facts and a whole bunch of concepts, a whole bunch of worlds, and then start putting them together. And when you're in a beginner mindset, and a beginner kind of way of thinking, you never get to that, because you always want things to be immediate gratification, you always want things to be self-contained, and by definition it's self-contained, and therefore basically what happens in beginners' texts is they just repeat one thing over and over 10,000 times. And of course that has its uses, because sometimes we need to do that. We need to get that basic thing into your mind 10,000 times, and some entire textbooks are just repeating the same thing in 10,000 different ways with different stories and different parables and different metaphors. But if you do want to get to somewhere correct, you need to sort of be able to get this thing where you don't assume that the book will say the same thing twice. And this is extremely important. You know, the Rambam says in one of his famous letters that in the entire Torah it says that monotheism is only mentioned once, according to him. So the pasuk Shema Yisrael Hashem Echad, and Parshas V'Eschanan, that's the only time where it says that there's only one God. Of course, the entire Torah assumes that, but the only verse that explicitly talks about this is one in the entire, maybe in the entire Bible, but probably not. But at least in the entire Torah, in the all 5 books, there's only one word that says monotheism, which is for him for sure the basis of everything and the most basic thing. In other words, and the reason he understands there's a reason for it, but the reason. What this means is that you can't expect the books or the teachers to repeat themselves all the time, and the fact that they don't repeat something a lot of times doesn't mean that it's not important, and something's the opposite. Sometimes the most important thing it says the least times, because, and at least one reason for this is because the more important things are the ones they expect you to know by yourself, or to grasp by yourself. And you're supposed to get to this line in the book and say, yes, this I agree with, and this is part of me, and this is part of my soul, this is part of my mind. And you don't really need the book. All the other details, things that are not so closely identified with yourself, they need to be repeated, they need to be elaborated because of their nature as not being part of you and not being so immediately identified with the knower. But the things that need to be immediately identified with you are by nature not repeated a lot. But anyways, this is a very important thing, and this is a very important basic definition of a advanced. In other words, it's not really advanced, because again, like we said, we don't mean advanced in the sense of skipping the basics. We want to get at the foundations of things. We want to build things up from the foundation. And it's just the opposite, of course, like everyone understands. Advanced courses, advanced learnings are always going to be able to touch foundations of things in a much deeper and a much more precise way than beginner's ways. Although those beginner's ways purport to give you just the foundations upon which you build, they're not really the foundations upon which anything real can be built. Real foundations are only gotten by getting into all the back and forth and all the questions and answers and all the shaklavetaria, right? All the back and forth, all the conversations and debates that happen, and in other words, all the things we don't know, and by that to try to figure out what is the foundation of things. So now, in this vein, the very important to remember that the Pardis is not a beginner's work, and like I said, there's in many times the beginner's works, and the Ramak himself actually did write a sort of summary. So if you would want a beginner's work, you want someone to tell you look, these are the 10 Sefirot, these are their names, this is what they mean, this is what they are, this is what they're made out of, this is what they're for, this is where they come from, this is where they go to. This is not that book. Of course, you'll get all this information from this book, but that's not the way it's organized. Ramak himself wrote a beginner's book, which is called Arnerav, which he, I'm pretty sure, wrote after the Pardus, because it summarizes the Pardus. And again, you see that in his mind, in his way of working, that comes after. Of course, he writes it, and this is something that you see great people doing many times, right? First, they write this serious book, the book for scholars, and then they write the book for simpler people. And then if you're like a Talmud, you're a student, and you want to read only the book for the second book, you have to remember that this is really not the order of learning. The order of learning is the other way around, and everyone should really be learning in this order. So now back to where I am. The big thing in this book is that he, of course, starts foundationally, and we'll try to define what to him are the foundations, both of the ontology, both of the metaphysics, both of the actual reality that is trying to describe what are the foundations of that. What are the foundations epistemologically? What is the foundations of how we know what we know about this? And what are the foundations textually, which to him might be the same thing as the second one, but we'll see as we get through the first chat, we'll see that there's a lot to talk about this. But that is really how he works. And because of that, it takes him a very long time to get to the basic questions that everyone would ask in the first second. Okay, you want to tell me about Kabbalah? So what is Kabbalah? What is it about? What is it for? What does it do? All of those questions. It takes him, even just to ask the basic question of what the definition of Sefirot are, takes him until the 4th Shot. So I want you to see, and I'm going to go through some of this, and it's important to see because this is the headers and the table of contents that Ramak himself wrote for this book. So you see what it includes and how it's sort of set up. And mostly I'm going to focus right now on the first 5-10 Sha'arim, which go through really the most basic. I'm at least going to go to the 9th, 10th, 11th, which give you the most basic structure of how this is organized, and then we'll try to start the first chapter of the book. So you'll see the first shar is called Shar 10 and not 9. And this is the shar we're going to be hopefully studying today. And there he explains what is accepted and what is received. Well, how he says, Chachamenu Zekanenu v'Nevi'enu. It's written wrong here. It's be our prophets, right? Nevi'enu. So everyone agrees, well, all mekabolim, and to him this means both the Chachamim, both the Nevi'im, both everyone which receives Kabbalah from us. We'll see where he goes through this, and maybe he means something precise with all these words, Chachamim, Zekenim, Nevi'im, that there are 10 Sefirot precisely, not more, not less. Now the second shot is really what we would assume foundationally to be before that, but to him it's the second thing, and because of the way in which he thinks it makes sense to do things like this, is Shar Tam Ha'atzilut. And in this Shar he answers the question, why is there Atzilut? Why are there 10 Sefirot? And he really divides this into two questions, which is why there are 10 and why there are Sefirot at all. Both of these questions are answered in great detail and bringing a bunch of different opinions and deciding which one is right in the second Shar. The third Shar seems to be a sort of side detail, but actually if you'll get to it and connect this Shar with the first and the second and the third and the fourth and all of them, you see that it's a very extremely foundational thing. He calls it a question. He calls it in the name of a question. Ima insaf wa keter, and in it he discusses the machlokes, which he claims that there's a machlokes, and there is really a machlokes, which is if the insaf, which is the source of all the sefirot, is himself the first sefirah called keter or not. We'll get to what all these things mean. Don't worry, I'm just going through that, and that's the third shot. And again, these all before you get to even answering what Sefirot are, and that is actually the subject of the fourth Shar, which is theologically one of the most important Shurim in the entire book, which is called Shar Atzmut Vekelim, in which he discusses if the Sefirot are Atzmut, so the essence of God, or tools of God, Kelim. So we have to get to that. Now the next few Sharim are describing what everyone would expect to be described when you talk about Sefirot, which is what their order is, what they do, and so on. So the fifth Shar is Seder Atzilut, which discusses the order in time, or so-called time, as we'll get to, which Sefirah was first and which is after, and different opinions on that. The sixth one is their order of standing, so not the order of their creation or atzilut or emanation, but their order of their existence. So who was on top, who's on the bottom, who's on the side, who's not on the side. Of course, as he right away says here, these are not spatial concepts to be taken literally. It's not existing in space, but that's the language he's speaking. And again, another thing to talk about. The seventh shad is called Shad HaTzinorot, which is really an elaboration of Shad Shmini. So conceptually, you can see it as part of this, Shad Seder Amidatan, and Shad HaTzinorot, which is talking about another detail in something known as Tzinorot, which you'll find in different Kabbalah books, which are, Tzinorot literally means pipes, going between one sfira and another sfira, and how many of them are there, and how they work, and so on. The eighth Shad is, again, not theologically, but probably Kabbalistically, for the basic meaning of Kabbalah, is probably one of the most important Shiurim, and it's called Shad Mahut V'Hanaga, in which he answers the question of what is the essence, and of course he says not essence, but something like essence, which we understand by Sfirot. In other words, each Sfira, what does it do? What does Chesed mean? What does Gevurah mean? And Hanaga, in other words, how the providence of God is related by these Sfirot, so how these Hanaga, each Sfira in its own Hanaga, and them all together, and each what they do basically, what Sfirot do. Okay, so that's the eighth shad, right? And the ninth shad, which seems to be missing here, so just telling you, I see it's missing in this text, we'll have to put it in. It's Shad HaMachriim, which is another important thing. It's important because you're going to see that right in the first chapter. In the first chapter, it's interesting that it's missing here. I'll have to fix it. In the first chapter, right away, he already discusses this concept, so we'll see. So again, it's another thing that we'll see, that he himself told us in the previous preface, that another sort of that differentiates this from a beginner's work, which is that he always assumes that you know everything, although that's not really true, right? So in a certain way, it's less systematic. Again, it's less systematic in the sense that he could assume knowledge that you're not supposed to be knowing yet, right? And this is really a problem if someone wants to write a book in entirely pedagogical order, right? An entirely educational order. I'm going to teach you things, and then right away you're going to start knowing things. But the reality is that anyone that wants to learn things seriously is going to always run into this problem, and there's no way out of it. So what you actually do when you learn is you try to learn a little here and a little from this way and slowly understand, because the truth is that to understand the first chapter in any book or in any subject, really, I'm just using chapters of the books as a container for talking about this, requires knowing the 10th chapter, and we're literally up to the 9th chapter here, right? Shad Tes. In order to understand what it means, and we're going to go to the first perek, for example, I'm just use the example that you will see soon. In order to understand the first Mishnah in Sefer Yitzira, which talks about the 10 Sefirot and proving that they exist and what their source is and how they work, you need to understand the structure of the 10 Sefirot in order to just read what it says and to understand, are we even on the correct path? And in order for that, to understand that, you're going to need to know something about Mahut V'Hanaga. You're going to need to know something about what Sefirot are, because these are texts that always say the whole thing at once. They're not literally spoon-feeding you one thing by one. And you need to know what Machri'im means. So Machri'im is just a basic concept that Sefirot are divided into different orders, what we call very much known as left and right, or up and bottom, and different directions. And there's always something in between them to be Machri'a. In other words, to mediate between two opposites or two differences. And of course, there's different levels of this, and a whole shah talking about different kinds of Machri'im. So that's another very important, again, it's conceptually connected to Mahut V'Hanaga or to Shad HaTzinorot. So all of these sort of form one big picture of the Sefirot. The 10th Shad is called Shad HaGvanim. So this is sort of a detail which you might be able to skip in some sense. And Gavanim means literally colors, and it's talking about colors, which these are ascribed to different Sefirot and other books and how they work and so on. The 11th Shad is important, again, something that was important already for the first Shad, and we'll have to defer to this to understand some things there, which is called Shad HaTzachtzachot, which is discussing some sort of thing that exists above the Sefirot. Okay, the 12th Shad, so this is a detail, we could call it a detail, it's not a basic structural thing. The 12th Shad is another detail, which is known as the 32 Nitivot, which are connected to the Sefirah of Chokhmah, which have 32 Nitivot Chokhmah, so what they are. The 13th Shad is called Sha'arim, which is about 50 gates of Binah. So again, the Sefirah of Binah has something called 50 gates, which is some detail which we have to understand. Very interesting Shad. Every Shad is interesting, but this is some a detail again. The 14th Shad is a very important basic understanding of Sefirot Ramak again, which he calls Shad HaMetziut, which to him means something very important, which is that there is existences, so really what we call bechinot generally. In Sefirot, although there are 10 Sefirot, we can talk about each Sefirah in so far as it's doing something like this, or as far as it is something, so we could really find a huge amount of existences. This is the word that he uses for this. In each Sefirah, and you'll see that this is something that he uses from the first word, but actually to get to define it and to prove it, it's going to have to wait until the 14th Shah. The 15th is another very important basic thing, which is called Shah Mimata Lamala, which is the idea of each Sefirah having what's known in other languages as precession and reversion or conversion. So the Sefirot go from the bottom down, so Keta to Malchut, and then have the same thing going back up. And this is again something that has to be explained, and again something that he already uses always. But the 16th is again something basic or somewhat basic, which is called Shara Biyah, Atzilut Bria Yitzira Asiyah, and he explains the idea of the Sefer Tikunei Zohar, which is not the Zohar itself, as you see himself knows, but that there's 4 times 10 Sefirot Atzilut, and again known as Atzilut Bria Yitzira Asiyah. This is also something that you'll see right in the first chapter that he references this. So, okay, the 17th is some more of a detail. It's called Yerech Yaakov, discussing something known about the Pegam of Sfirat Ahad, which is symbolized by Yaakov Avinu's foot being hurt by the Malach and so on. 18th is called Miut HaYerach, which discusses the moon becoming smaller, which symbolizes the Shekhinah and Galut HaShekhinah and things like that. And that's basically most of the Shi'urim about Olam HaTzilut and its concepts. Now the 19th is about the Shem Havaya, explaining it. 20th is about other Shemes. 21st is about even more Shemes. 22nd is, again, a sort of important one. It's called Shar Erkei HaKinuyim, which discusses the different names for each Sfira, and there's lists and lists, literally a dictionary, based on the Zohar. Shar HaKinuyim is explaining what that means, and Erkei HaKinuyim is making the list and the dictionary that we find in. So if you want to understand the basic meaning of terms in Zohar, this 23rd Shah is a very good resource. Then 24th talks about something called Echalot of Kedusha. 25 is about the Echalot of Tumah, the concept of Klipot, and 26 is connected to that, the Echalot of Klipah. 27 is about the letters, 28 about Nekudot, 29 about Ta'amim, 30 about Siruf, so different ways of playing with letters. And so these are all details. The last 2 are also very important. 31 is about the neshama, so what the human soul is and how it works and where it comes from. Very important for understanding the Ramak's understanding of the soul. And 32 is about kavanah, so what it means to have kavanah and how to do it and all of that. Okay, so this we already discussed. So these are the 32 sharim, and again, this is again, if you want to basically answer the basic questions of what Sefirot are, how they work, you're going to really want to go through these few Shi'urim. So maybe there's 10. In other words, as the first Shah, which just gives you the existence of Sefirot and gives you the sources of it and why and what, which is Atzmut V'Kelim, their order, the relations between them, what they do, and the different connections in them. So basically these, I guess until 15 I would say, but not each one. So if you want to have some sort of order in your mind, that's really what. And then the rest are different sugyot, different concepts of Kabbalah that we have to know. Okay, that was all preface. There's one more important thing that I forgot to say earlier about what you gain about being able to buy context. So really, and this is a very important thing, I'll say it here, what is known as Torah Tasod. So what is Torah Tasod? And in which way are we going to be keeping this a secret? And this is a question that we can't deny this question. And although, of course, if Kabbalah is a secret nowadays, I don't know that it's a secret. You can buy it in every bookstore in the world, and it's on the internet for everyone to see. And my class is not going to change much of that. But it seems to be important to the people that were teaching this, that this is an esoteric wisdom, that this is a secret knowledge. And what does that mean, and how do we even practice that? So one of the most basic things that esoteric knowledge means is knowledge that assumes a whole bunch of context. And in a certain sense, knowledge that is, we allow ourselves to teach, or allow ourselves to speak, or allow ourselves to play around with, because we have the protection of a certain context. So of course everyone understands, and not everyone, but everyone understands that you cannot go out and between people who have no background, who have no context, and start talking about deep secrets, both because they're going to laugh at you, which is never recommended. Maybe someone wants to do some sort of avodah with that, but it's not recommended. And secondly, because they will misinterpret it, right? They will never be able to understand it, and you will gain nothing out of that. So it's totally useless practice. And if it's in different contexts, you might get persecuted for it, like, famous mystics that were persecuted for saying things, and they were mostly wrong for saying those things, because there's not the point of saying things if nobody will understand them, and they'll think that you're saying bad things or dangerous things or heretical things, whatever it is. So, really, at least one extremely important thing to talk about Torat Asad is precisely this we've been going on about, which is that it doesn't allow beginner's manuals, right? Because beginner's manuals is literally breaking the boundary that creates the esoteric context. And because beginner's manuals means that I'm going to assume that you do not have context. So if you don't have context, how am I going to be able to put the secret into a place which is not a context for it? Which doesn't have all the different understandings that you're going to need in order to understand it correctly, to know what I'm talking about, to trust me, right? You need a context of trust, you need a context of openness, of a certain vulnerability to play with the most important things and not get burnt on purpose, at least. So really, Kabbalah is the kind of learning, the kind of wisdom that is only allowed to be, and only allows itself to be revealed, to be spoken of, when there is already the context built up to accept it. And this is a reason why, in my ideal, as I always say, my protection is that I'm trying to make things always more difficult and not more simple. Of course, not like Einstein said, right? Should make things as simple as they can be, but not simpler, right? So we need to have clarity, and we need to speak about things as clear as we could, but we also don't need to simplify them. We don't need to dumb them down. And dumbing them down is probably what is a bad thing to do. And not because it's bad, because you're doing something evil or something, but because you will never be able to get at the truth of this, which is by nature not dumbdownable, however the word that's saying. You cannot be dumbed down. And it requires you to build up context. And sometimes you have to come back and build up the context again because you forgot and so on. But that's why I want to do it in this order, because it allows us to. And that's why the Ramak does it, so that it allows you to get into places where it will never be allowed to. And allowed to in a psychological sense also, right? You need safe space to get into real important things. And the way to create that space is by not being a beginner. Okay, so let's start, and we'll start a little bit, tiny little bit. Okay, so this is the first shot. Wow, so many times the same mistake. So the first shot is, and he calls it Esev Letesha, and you'll find out at some point what this exactly means. This is the shad, and my definition for the shad, which he doesn't actually say, this is his definition, right? Yizbar echaysa askava bekabalas chachamenu uzkenenu nvienu shasfiros, I guess, hem esev letesha v'lechadas. So one thing very important, and of course you'll get to Perek Ches and you'll see if there's other sources for this knowledge. But one of the important things to him is to base Kabbalah in received tradition. This is literally what Kabbalah means, right? The received knowledge, the received tradition. And therefore, or at least this is his way of thinking, there might be other ways of thinking, and he quotes people that have other ways of thinking. But his way of thinking is that this should be learned from source texts, from canonical texts, from texts that he accepts as authoritative, in the same way in which we learn, at least people that accept the authority of the Talmud and of the Halakha learn them and accept that. They don't learn them from first principles, they learn them they read the text because they're authoritative and as authoritative text. That is also how he will found. That's the way in which he bases the entire Kabbalah. Of course, he believes that there is a logic for this and there's a meaning for this. It's not meaningless things that we just have to accept on faith. But that is the way in which, that is at least his method of learning. So that's for sure one thing. We can actually ask to what extent he believes that that's the reason, that's the source of truth. And that's always a very deep question to ask anyone that presents some sort of thing which says, okay, well, this is not a rational science, or at least doesn't begin as a rational science, doesn't begin by sitting around and thinking, it begins by listening, right? It begins by receiving Kabbalah. Does that mean that you believe that it really has no logical basis, that it has no rational basis, so to speak? That's one question. Second question is, do you really believe that there's no access, which is, someone can say, okay, no, of course it is rational, it's true, right? So if it's true, then at least theoretically there's a reason, and we could sort of follow the logic. Maybe after we receive it, we could follow the logic that proves it, that shows it to be such. But maybe there's no access to it, right? We cannot get to it by way of reason. We need to believe someone, or we need to like somehow that empirically saw it. Sometimes we speak about like this, right? We need to ask someone that was there, and they'll tell it to you because there's no other way to get to it. Or that's, even that's not entirely the case, and there is ways to get to it on your own, whether in rational ways or in mystical ways, whichever they are, but there's still ways to get them. They're not ways of just reading a book and believing what he says. They're both ways of having the knowledge by yourself. I don't know that Ramak will disagree with any of these ways, but I do know that he definitely organizes the way of learning, and this is probably a correct way of learning in general, by reading the books that say these things. That's how he starts, and that's why he names his first shot as the shot, which explains, or basically establishes, that everyone agrees. So the Kabbalah, if the main thing of Kabbalah is what people have received, what the masters of this knowledge have told us, so of course that doesn't mean that they always agree. So this, of course, one of the big interesting things, and some of the people who have written anti-Kabbalah creeds have made a lot of this question. They said, well, if you received wisdom, how are there disagreements in Kabbalah? And there's disagreements on every page of Kabbalah. There's not one thing that's agreed upon, just like anything else Jews don't agree on. We don't agree on the most basic theology, and we don't agree on the most basic mystical Kabbalah, or whatever that is. So there's not agreement, and if you read this book, you see every page is based on disagreements. So, of course, it's not a real question, because you can say, well, it was received and then we forgot, or we don't know how to interpret it, so there's not really a problem for some sort of criticism. I don't know what kind of criticism this is, but it is something that seems to bother people. It's something that seems to make some sort of difference when you try to construe a discipline as something that is only received, that's not given to human deliberation and knowledge. You can't have a popular vote to decide who is right. You need to know who is received. So it does make at least a big difference to get at the things that everyone agrees on, right? That's true in every discipline, but it's definitely true in disciplines that claim to be based in received wisdom. So of course there's a lot of different machloikas and all kinds of details, but he starts with the thing that everyone agrees on. And according to him, and we'll see that this itself is not simple, and maybe totally not accepted nowadays, but at least according to him, the one thing that everyone agrees on, right? The one thing that everyone agrees, so that's definitely the tradition, is that there are 10 Sefirot and that there are 10. So number one, that there are 10 Sefirot. We'll get to that in a second. And that there are 10, so not 9, not 8, and not 11, exactly that number. And of course, we have to ask if there's a meaning to this number or what exactly it means, but according to him, there's a meaning, and he has the explanations for all of this going on. But the first thing that this tells us is that this is the received truth for him. So it's the truth that there are 10 Sefirot. So since it's very hard, and this is really interesting, since what the Sefirot are is not in machloket. There's a machloket in that. There's not a yaskama. Not everyone agrees. And how to understand them, not everyone agrees. And what they do, not everyone agrees. But everyone agrees that they are, and that they are this number. So at least if we want to base Kabbalah on the most basic thing, for the Ramak, that would be this. So that's what he discusses in this shara. That's the way in which he organizes it and makes it work. Okay. So that's his header, and let's get into the thing itself for a second. So now let's start. And he starts by saying this is very well known. Everyone knows that everyone who works in this discipline knows that there's 10 sefirot. There's no machlokes in this. And he says this is one of the things on which there is a brit. So we'll see in a minute, maybe you understand what this means. So some people say just repeating itself. I see all the actually important people that have interpretations of this book, and they say what he means to say is just that everyone agrees, so there's like a bris, so everyone agrees, we're all part of some sort of circle that all agrees on that. That doesn't seem to me what he means. I think what he means is that it's not only agreed by everyone also agrees that it would be very bad. So it's like there's like a mitzvah almost. And brit is, we'll see the language of the Sefer Yetzira, which talks about nichrat brit sometime in different ways, but at least one of the ways is like a brit is basically a contract, basically an obligation. So there's an obligation to believe, to accept that there are 10 sefirot and not make a mistake and say that there are 9, because there's reasons to make those mistakes, as we'll see. There's reasons to think that there are 9, there's reasons to think there are 11, but this is one of the things that you're sworn to when you enter this chokhmah, to never say that there's different number than 10. So that's basically what it means. And now we'll need to actually ask him, or needs to ask himself, who told him this, right? So now, maybe we should say something even more basic, which is that this book is a book of Chachmata Kabbalah. And when you say the word Kabbalah, people might associate it with many different things. Even in his time, there were different things associated with different things. But for the Ramak, for sure, and for the Zohar, and the sources that he assumes he accepts, Kabbalah is just another word for saying the Torah of the 10 Sefirot. So there is Kabbalah, theoretically, that at least doesn't center the 10 Sefirot. There's parts of Kabbalah that seem to not really be related to the 10 Sefirot. Actually, were precisely those parts which the Ramak mostly ignores in this book, like Gilgulim, like Sirufei Otiyot, different things that might not be at all connected to the 10 Sefirot, or at least not be centered on that. But for him, and for the Zohar and all the students of the Zohar and the Rabbi Jektila and a lot of what's the normative school of Mekabalim, definitely what's known as Kabbalah and generally, is the school of the 10 Sefirot. So Kabbalah literally means 10 Sefirot. The existence of 10 Sefirot. Again, I didn't tell you what this is and what they do and what they are, but that is what Kabbalah is. So if someone tells you some things like Kabbalah, like some random thing, it might have some connection, but really the study of Kabbalah is just the study of these 10 Sefirot and knowing about them and learning about them. Now, where does this come from? So the Ramak, in this sense, is very critical in the sense of trying to get at the first primary source of everything. We need to go back to the earliest source, which at least mentions the word 10 Sefirot, right? And the earliest source is, of course, as he says, we have with us the book called Sefer Yetzira. This is definitely, and this is historically accepted too, definitely the earliest Jewish book, but probably the earliest book that mentions the word 10 Sefirot in the context. We'll see if it's in the context, but at least in the way which the Mekabalim read to mean the 10 Sefirot which they believe in. Now, how old is the Sefer Yetzira? Now, if the Sefer Yetzira is a book about the 10 Sefirot is itself a good question, so we'll get to that. But how old is the Sefer Yetzira? So the Ramak here is interestingly, and I think always is somewhat critical and somewhat not. He says, the Sefer Yetzira itself seems to ascribe itself to Avraham Avinu. It says, Mechunel Avraham Avinu. I think that's, at least there's a plausible reading of the end of Sefer Yetzira, which says, Vekesh Hevin Avraham Avinu. So he sort of presents Avraham Avinu as the one who achieved all these secrets that the Sefer Yetzira is discussing. And I think even more radically than that, understands that the story that we learn about Avraham Avinu discovering God is really the story of him discovering the wisdom of Sefer Yetzira. So that is what the book itself seems to say. But as he says, this is not agreed upon. It's not agreed that it's actually Avram's book. Some people say it's Rabbi Akiva's book. I'm not sure who this was. And some people might say different things. I'm not sure what the source of thinking it's Rabbi Akiva's book is. There might be reasons to thinking that what's accepted on researchers is that it's unknown. Nobody knows who wrote it. What we do know is that it's the earliest book that the Mekabalim are reading. definitely preceded all of at least the publication, and even according to the traditional dating of the Zohar precedes the Zohar. The Zohar quotes the Sefer Yetzirah openly, so it obviously precedes it, and it can be ascribed to the at least Talmudic or Mishnaic times. It's written in the language of the Mishnah, which makes us think that it's written in the times of the Mishnah or slightly later, but it's definitely an ancient book. So, the first book. Now, and since we got here, we're going to have to, and now what he does, and now the Sefer Yetzirah, I'm going to try to bring you a text of it so we could see it tiny bit, so we get some sort of picture of what's going on here. Let me do this. See how I do it. Give me a second. I will want to read a little bit Sefer Yetzirah to get understanding of what's going on and how we get to here. But at least let's first talk about what he does here. Now, the Sefer Yetzirah, in general, is a book. Well, it's called Sefer Yetzirah, which means the book of creation. Yetzirah being some term for creation. Of course, according to Kabbalah, there's Atzilut, Bri'ah, Yetzirah, Asiyah. So Yetzirah is the third world. I don't think the Sefer Yetzirah is generally taken to mean that. Of course, there are Mekabalim that read it according to that difference. But generally, Sefer Yetzirah is the book of creation. And it's a book which famously is supposed to tell you how to do creation yourself. And it might be mentioned in the Talmud as L'chot Yetzirah, which, according to the stories in the Talmud, are ways or instructions of creating things, right? You might be able to create an animal, maybe create a human. That's what it says in the Talmud, that if you know the Sefer Yetzirah, or this knowledge is attributed to Sefer Yetzirah, not clear that it means literally this book. That's definitely what many people understand. Some people argue with this. But that's what seems to be the subject of the Sefer Yetzirah according to the Talmud, some sort of book of cosmology, or book of the basic ingredients of the universe. And if you understand them, you might, just like science is based on understanding the science, technologies, it grows out of science. So this is some sort of technology that grows out of this, which is making a goyla, making a person, and Kabbalah Masid. Now, already from the beginning of Kabbalah, in other words, the early Mekabalim, played down this part of Sefer Yetzirah at least. The Ramak definitely, he has, over here he's going to go through 2-3 Mishnayot of it, but he has an entire work dedicated to commentating on the Sefer Yetzirah, and he says openly, I'm not going to be explaining to you how to make a golem. If you want that information, you'll have to find a different book. I'm just going to give you the theoretical, Kabbalistic interpretation of this. So that's definitely one thing about Sefer Yetzirah that's important to know, that although even based on the Talmud that seems to have its goal, the creation, or understanding creation, or understanding therefore how to work with creation, and maybe make people and make things, that is not how the Mekabalim read it in the most part. They all agree that that might be possible maybe. The Ramak definitely ignores that entirely, and the Ramak generally is an extremely rational Kabbalist. Rational maybe is not the correct word, but he's extremely theoretical and intellectual. He's interested in understanding things, not interested in creating things, not interested in changing things, not interested in doing magic. He's not interested in anything like that. So that is definitely what he understands. And I think that's part of what he says. If you read the next line, he says, okay, so number one, he says it's not agreed upon generally who wrote it. It's definitely the most ancient book. In other words, it's definitely for him and the way he structures this work. This is definitely the first source for Esesfirot, and this is the source that he's going to base the existence of Esesfirot on, and according to interpretations of the Zohar and others, but that's his first source. But he doesn't entirely know basically who wrote it. But it's definitely to him accepted as an important book. Now he says this is a very deep book. Most people do not know what it means. There's many interpretations, and after all that, for the most part, we do not know what he's saying. And he says, in a different place, it's actually missing some part here. This, again, it looks like I copied a text that's missing. Oh, it's here. And he quotes the first Mishnah, the second and third Mishnah. I'll get you that in a minute. And then he says, I've already thought not to give any explanations. It's definitely above our mind, above our understanding. Maybe Rashbi, maybe Rabbi Akiva, who are literally angels in the sky, maybe they could understand it, but we can't. But it's an obligation. There are many, so we will try as the best that we could, and we'll explain it. So that's very important. I'm focusing on this for a second because you see the Ramak himself, because this, I want to open this a little slightly up, this question of Sefer Yetzirah and what it's doing before, and next time we'll get to his actual way of reading it and what he does, and maybe in 2 times. But we see the Ramak himself being very clear that there are 1,000, well, I don't know if you know about 1,000, but 10 different interpretations of Sefer Yetzirah, and after all of them, it's hard to say that any one of them got the correct answer, and he's going to try his best to interpret it, and it's important, of course, because this is his first source for Esesfirot, and he doesn't entirely know who it's from, and he thought maybe he shouldn't interpret it at all, but he's going to have to anyways. So let's do this. Let's just read some Sefer Yetzirah, and I'll tell you why I want to do this, because when you read it, and especially the way, and if you hear of it, and the way you're hearing it in this book, you will assume that it's a really complex work to read, and that is not true. Although Sefer Yetzirah, what it means, what it even saying, sometimes there's language, there's different sentences that nobody entirely knows what they mean, or that it's hard to decide what they mean. But the actual structure of the book and the actual basic, what's going on, the basic outline of the book is extremely clear, maybe one of the clearer books that exist in the tradition, and you should know what it is. So the Sefer Yetzirah, and the one I have here is some sort of reconstruction. Another problem with Sefer Yetzirah is just like it has many interpretations, it has many versions, many girsot, probably as many interpretations as there are, that's how many different versions of it there are of the actual texts. And we could, many different ways of organizing them, and there's been a lot of work done on that. But generally, there's shorter ones and longer ones. We could assume the shorter ones are the earlier ones, and the later people add things. And sometimes with the additions just make things clearer, or they say things that are more or less obvious if you at least understand it in the same way that whoever added the second part understood it. Sometimes they add different pieces of knowledge that are not accepted, and so on. But that's the basic story with this book. Now, the important thing is that the Sefer Yetzirah has an extremely simple theory of the world. In other words, simple in its structure, not simple to get at what he's trying to get at, but he has a very simple theory. And now Sefer Yetzirah has 5 or 6 chapters, but the most basically is based on 32 things. And this is something important to realize, although, and we have to remember this, everyone has to agree with this pshat, the Kabbalah have an explanation for this, but this is agreed upon. I'm not getting to any controversial territory here. According to Sefer Yetzirah, which, again, what it's exactly talking about is going to be controversial, but it seems to be giving a theory of Yetzirah, right, of the creation of the world, and is sort of saying that it's connected or based on or grows out of, that's already, or is something called 32 things, which he calls 32 netivot pliot chachma. Okay? So where did he get the number 32 is another question, and how it's connected to Parshat Bereshit. It's connected to 10,000 things, but there's a number 32. And he actually goes on to say what these 32 are. So although the Mekabulim have, like we saw earlier, there's a whole Shad and Pardis called Sharan and Tivot, which goes through 32 different concepts, or 32 different things that are said to be these 32 Netivot Chachma. What the Sefer Yetzirah actually means by this, or at least in the context of his basic structure of the book, is extremely obvious and simple, which are that he says that the world is created. Well, he calls them 3 books, and not clear what these 3 books are. But in any case, the world is created out of 2 things, which are 10 Sefirot and 22 letters. So 22 letters are the 22 letters of the Hebrew alphabet, which he then divides further in different ways. But we'll get to that in a minute. But the 22 plus 10, which he calls 10 Sefirot Belima. Those, now 10 and 22, as everyone who can count knows, is 32. And these are the 32 Netivot Chachma with which the world was created. That is the entire Sefer Yetzirah in one word. So there's 32 Netivot, and in some versions it says it openly right here. 32 Netivot are 22 letters and 10 Sefirot. What 10 Sefirot actually mean is a very good question. But there are 10. What they are, in other words, how to, now just to be clear, what are the things that are explicit and what are not explicit? And therefore what is agreed upon, what everyone has to interpret, and what is speculation, right? Now what the 22 letters are, everyone knows. What the 10 Sefirot are, the Sefer Yetzirah actually counts 10 Sefirot in the end. So going back to, there's 5 chapters. The first chapter And see, they gave headers to the chapters. I think these headers they made up. But the first chapter is about the 10 Sefirot. And it has 7 or 8 Mishnayot. And each one starts as a Sefirot Bilima and says something about it. As a Sefirot Blima and tells you something about it. As a Sefirot Blima gives you something about it. As a Sefirot Blima says something about it. As a Sefirot Blima says something about it. As a Sefirot Blima, and here he already starts counting 10. So again, to be clear, we have, and working with this version, it's saying as a Sefirot and saying something about it. Number 2 as a Sefirot saying something about it. Number 3 as a Sefirot saying something about it. Number 4 as a Sefirot saying something about it. Number 5, he already counts the 10. So there's some kind of enumeration of 10 things here, which are probably the 10 Sefirot. Then again says something about it. And then here, this is his definitive elaboration of what the 10 Sefirot are. And he literally counts Achat, Shtaim, Shalosh, and then Arba, and then Chamesh until 10. So these are the 10 Sefirot. And he finishes Elo es Sefirot and counts them again. So these are the 10 Sefirot. So there's no doubt that the first chapter of Sefer Yetzirah is elaborating the 10 part of the 32 that he posits. There's 32, which is made out of 22 and 10. And these are the 10. And it tells you what the 10 are and a bunch of things about them. And then the rest of the book, so most of the book actually is talking about the 22 letters. And he divides the 22 letters into 3 categories, 3 levels, called 3, 7, and 12. Which are the letters Emesh, Begat, Kefrat, and the rest of them. And then says a bunch of things about these letters. So, in other words, to make it even more simple, you'll see if chapter 2 is about the 22 letters in general. Then, since he divided these 22 letters into three floors, so to speak, 3 levels, which he calls Shalosh Imot, Sheva Kfulot, Ushtem Esrei Pshutot. So then, going on, the Perek Gimel, the 3rd chapter, is about the Shalosh Imot, and he talks about them, and each, again, works with the same structure. So each Mishnah, each part starts with Shalosh Imot, Shalosh Imot, Shalosh Imot, Shalosh Imot, and says things about them. Then the 4th chapter is about the Sheva Kfulot, so the 2nd level of the 20 letters, Sheva Kfulot, Sheva Kfulot, Sheva Kfulot, talks about them. And then the 5th chapter is about the Shtem Esrei Pshutot, and talks about them. Now the 6th chapter is, again, general things. It's a very unclear chapter what it means. It might be just an addition. What exactly he's saying is not clear to anyone that I know. But that's the Sefer Yetzirah, and it's a really short work. Even in the long versions, it's like 2,000 words. It's a really short, and you could know it by heart, at least according to some versions. You have to figure out which version to memorize. But it's something that you should be able to have in your mind easily and not get confused when someone quotes you there. And you'll see when the way that Ramak reads, and he quotes language, and he makes the yukim and tries to, in every word, what does it mean, and why does it say this word and not that word, and so on and so on. But in the most basic sense, Sefer Yetzirah is the most simple work that you could read. And if you want to read one book that says all of Kabbalah, according to the Kabbalah, you should read Sefer Yetzirah, because it includes everything, although you might not understand one word. The structure of the book and what it's trying to say, or at least what it's about, is as clear as can be, and that is the Sefer Yetzirah. Okay? I hope that was simple enough. Now, let's try to get a tiny bit more into what we need to get here. So now, if you'll ask anyone that just read the Sefer Yetzirah in some unbiased way, again, it's a very outlandish word, unbiased, but anyone that reads the Sefer Yetzirah will tell you, as the Sefer Yetzirah itself has a header and says that it's about the 32 Nitivot Chochmah, and explaining these 32 as 10 and 22. And there seems to be no reason in Pshat to think that the 10 are more basic than the 22 or more important. Let's depending on, again, on how you read it, that's the important thing, really. Right? Let's assume that these are powers that are running the parts of the universe, and later you'll see that he literally ascribes different parts, different days, different attributes of the world, different things, different signs into these letters and so on. So you might say, okay, so that's what it's about. Now, the thing is that the 10 Sefirot, firstly, it's not clear what they are at all. So most people that were not Mekabolim will assume that there are 10 numbers. In other words, he's working with the idea that the world is created with letters and numbers. So letters are the 22 Hebrew letters, and numbers are the 10, Arab base 10 number system, which he assumes to be the natural number system. And since people count with their hands. And this is important for him, actually, as we'll see. And the hand has 10 fingers, so a natural number system is a base 10 number system. And therefore, we could talk about the world as being created by letters and numbers, 10 letters, 10 numbers, and 22 letters. That's one interpretation, at least, that exists. Now, in this interpretation, it's something that needs to be figured out according to all interpretations, but in general, which becomes much more clearer when you're according to Kabbalah, which is basically the theory of the 10 Sefirot, right? So really what Kabbalah is doing, and what Ramak is going to be doing here, is saying how the first chapter of Sefer Yetzirah is way more foundational than all the other chapters. And this is something that you would not find in the book itself. It's not something that you would assume probably by reading the book, and it's still not 100% clear that that's the true interpretation. So they would, but this is definitely, and if you read any Kabbalistic interpretation of Sefer Yetzirah, the Ravid and others, they all, well, some of them literally only interpreted the first chapter, or even the ones that not, are basically reading all the other chapters into the first chapter. So they're saying that these 10 Sefirot are in some way the basis of everything else, and the 22 letters are just some detail in the 10 Sefirot, or some sort of emanation from them, however exactly you're going to understand it, or a body to them. There are a lot of different ways of reading these connections. There was one person, Rabbi Avram Abulafia, which came out against this and said that the Kabbalists are giving way too much time to the 10 Sefirot, and they should give more time to the 22 letters. And there's some dialectic within the entire history of Kabbalah that's going back and forth on this, but it's at least agreed upon in all Mekabalim that are not Abulafia, that the 10 Sefirot are more basic and more foundational than the 22 letters, and that is really what the secret of Kabbalah is about. And 22 letters might be one way of understanding them, and need to fit into that. And in other words, that the first chapter of Sefer Yetzirah is talking about these 10 Sefirot, and this is really what we need to get to. Okay, so that is the most important thing. Okay, I think that's enough for now, but you should read and try to think by yourself what the Sefer Yetzirah might be doing, and how it connects to things, and read some things, people saying things about this, but this is really what he says. Now, having said all this, we can understand that if we want to go, and this is what Ramak is also going to do, if we want to go to the first source of 10 Sefirot and see what they are, this is basically where we should be, and this is literally where the Ramak takes us. So he takes us entirely to where we expect him to take us. He's not doing anything surprising here, and saying, okay, you want to learn about the 10 Sefirot, so let's go to Sefer Yetzirah. To him it's Perek Aleph Mishnah Gimel, because in his version there's 2 Mishnahs before this, and this is the Mishnah that says Es Sefirot Belima, Mispar 10 Atzbaot, 5 כנגד 5, ובrit יחיד מכוונת באמצע, במיlat lashon ובמיlat מאור. That's his language. So here it says something different, but his language says, let's maybe go back to his language, and you'll see it in his version. Okay, so Es Sefirot Belima, right? That's basically the header of the Mishnah. Mispar 10 Atzbaot, it's the amount, just like of 10 fingers that you have. And then goes on to say it. So that's, again, reading the way that we're reading earlier. It's very simply saying that there are 10 Sefirot, which, well, if you think that it's 10 numbers, then it's obvious what he's saying. But of course, the Mekabalim are not going to think that it's 10 numbers. It's these 10 Sefirot which emanate from God and do everything that they do. So they're not really numbers. So we'll get to this. And these 10 are divided in some way into 2 and 2, just like your hand obviously have 2 hands, so the 10 fingers have right hand and left hand, 5 כנגד 5. And another important idea for the Ramak and for the Sefer Yetzirah is that there is a Brit, so some sort of thing, not sure what, Brit Yachid, in the middle. And the way the Ramak reads it is, in his language, in his version, b'milat lashon u'b'milat ma'or. In other words, that there's two britot. We'll see in a minute. He's going to explain this. There's in the middle of these 2, there's something called a brit. So there's your mouth. The way he understands it, that your mouth, brit lashon, milat lashon or brit lashon, is in the middle of your 10 fingers. And there's another brit, which is the brit milah, which is also middle of your 10 fingers. And he's going to explain what this means. But that's his literal interpretation of this Mishnah. I'm just going to go back to the Sefer Yetzirah a minute, so you'll see the rest of it. then he says, second Mishnah says, and this is the second Mishnah which gave our chapter its name, so it's important to read it, and he's going to, basically the Ramak in the rest of this shah, and he's going to bring in 10,000 different things, but the rest of this shah from here until the first 6 chapters are literally reading these 2 Mishnayot. So the first Mishnah, 10 Sfirot, 10 fingers, 5, 5, and Brit. And then the second Mishnah, which says 10 Sfirot, Belima. Well, what does that mean? Good question. 10 and not 9, Esev lo Tesha, Esev lo 11, 10 and not 11, Haven bechachma, vechacham bebina. So this seems to be the Sefer Yetzirah talking to us already. Think, understand the wisdom, the way he would read it, right? Understand with wisdom and be wise with understanding. But bechon be'em vechakor be'em, v'hamed davar al baryo, v'ashev yotzer al mechono. So what these things exactly mean, the Ramak is going to give a reason. You could see the English, how they read this. And that's the second Mishnah of Sefer Yetzirah. Now the third Mishnah is important because this is also where he got this. Es Sfirot Belima. And this seems to be reading what Belima means, at least one reading of Belima. Belom picha mildaber. So restrain your mouth from speaking. Belom libcha milarher. Restrain your heart from your mind or your heart from thinking. V'imratz lubcha shuv lemakom. And if your heart runs, wants to think, go back to where you came from. So again, I think this is why I said when the Ramak said he's reading that is going on everything that has been said preceding this. So the fact that there's 10, the fact that there's not 9, the fact that you have to and so on. These are all things that there is a brit, a covenant made regarding all these things that you have to make sure to keep it, right? So in other words, these are the correct ways of learning it, it's the correct ways of accepting it. Okay, now, I just want to read a little bit more and you'll see, I'll try to read the whole chapter quickly. And again, Es Sfirot Belima, now it says something else. Na'ut sofan betchilatan v'tchilatan besofan, their beginning is connected to its end, and their end to beginning, kishal hevet b'gechelet, like a fire connected to its coal, to the burning coal, so there's some sort of unification of the entire 10 Sefirot from beginning to end. Shayotzer echad ve'en lo sheni, because the Creator has one and not a second. He has some sort of reading of this. V'lifnei echad ma'ata zofer. What is this language saying is not clear here. Before one, you cannot count. Okay, but it seems to be clear that it's to him the concept of Sefirot are connected to the concept of counting. And probably I think that that's the literal meaning. It means numbers. So saying the beginning of numbers are connected to the end. So the 1 is connected to the 10. And you cannot go before the 1. What exactly this means in the context of the Creator being 1 and not second, I don't know. We don't know. At least not for sure, right? Okay, now, important Mishnah, the 5th Mishnah, because he says, Es Sfirot Belima, again. Umidatan Es she'en la ensaf. Their measure is 10, which is infinite. Has no end, right? It's limitless, infinite. So he's giving some sort of measure of the Sfirot, although he says they don't have an end. And he's giving them a dimension like this. Omek Reshit. So he reads Omek dimension, or generally it's read as depth of beginning and end. Omek Acharit. So that's 2. Omek Tov, Omek Ra. So that's 4. And then he has the 6 cardinal directions. Omek Rom, so up. Omek Tachat, down. Mizrach, Marav, Tzofon, Darom, north, east, west, north and south. So this is basically him counting the 10 Sefirot, right? So it's basically the 6 directions and Reshit, Tacharit, Tov and Ra. So very interesting understanding of what he means by 10 Sefirot. Ve Adon Yachid, El Melech Ne'eman, Moshel Bekulan, Mimon Kacho, V'adad Yad. The one God is reigning on all of them, right? Rules over all of them. That's, again, seems to be according to the way people read it before Kabbalah, seems to be related to the question of the one and the many, and how one God rules over many things. Okay, anyways. Then there's another interesting Mishnah, which is not clear what it means, but it seems to be connected with this Mishnah, right? Ratzov V'Shov, again, referencing the same pasuk in Yecheskel. Tzviyatan k'mareh habazak, they appear like bazak, whatever that is. V'tachlitan en lehem ketz, v'dvarob behen v'ratzov V'Shov. Okay, this Mishnah seems to be a set with this Mishnah in some way. Now the next Mishnah is a set with the earlier Mishnah of the 10 Amakim, but it seems another way of counting the 10 Sefirot, which needs to be sort of connected with the previous way. It's not clear how. But what he says is there are 10 Sefirot B'liman. He starts counting them. Achat. First is something called Ruach Elohim Chaim. Zui Ruach HaKodesh. So the Sefer Yetzira's theory is that there are three Yesodot called Ruach, Mayim, and Esh. So wind, water, and fire. And there's something before these three Yesodot, so he doesn't actually have a 4-element theory, he has a 3-element theory, but he claims that there are two kinds of wind. So Ruach Elohim, Ruach HaKodesh, so holy wind or holy air, and plain, regular, secular, normal air, so what we call physical or what we call air. So the first is Ruach Elohim Chaim. Of course, this is referencing the beginning of Bereshit and things. That's Ruach HaKodesh. Time from that is Ruach Miruach. So here we see some sort of progression in the 10 Sefirot, which we haven't seen before. And in that, he created 4 sides of heaven, whatever that means. Third is Mayim, Miruach, so water coming out of wind. And that created Tohu Vavohu V'Refesh V'Atit. And was carved Chakikan Kamin Aruga, Etzivan Kamin Chomas, Ichan Kamin Meziva. So this seems to be describing the creation of the world as it was described in the beginning of Bereshit. And first there was Ruach Elohim Chaim Merachefet, right? And then from that there were 4 sides of the heaven, and then there were Tohu Vavohu, which sort of created the 4 sides of the world, right? Like a garden or like a wall or like a ceiling and so on. And then Arba, the 4th, is Esh Mimayim, from water was fire, and this created, out of fire, created Kisei HaKavod, V'chol Tzva Marom, Shkach K'tiv, Otzeh Malachav Ruchot. So we read it, from the Ruchot came Malachim, and these are the fire, and that's the Ruach, another part of the world. And that's the first, so really this is the first 4 Sefirot are Ruach Elohim Chaim, Ruach Miruach, Mayim Miruach, and Esh Mimayim. So the supernal wind, the regular wind, water, and fire. Those are the first 4. And then the next 5 are again next 6 are again the 6 sides. So up. And then he gives a tziruf, a permutation of the first 3 letters of the Shem Havaya for each side, which is another interesting connection which needs to be understood. But these are the basic 2 Mishnayot which tell us what the 10 Sefirot are, and you'll see the Ramak later giving 10 different interpretations of this Mishnah, so it's important to know this, and so on. Up is Yud Ke Vav, down is Yud Vav Ke, east is He Vav Yud, west is He Yud Vav, south is Vav Yud He, and north is Vav He Yud. So these are the 6 sides, and Elu Es Sefirot, and he repeats them again, Ruach Elohim Chaim, Veruach Mayim Ve'esh, Malav Mata, Mizrach Ma'arav, Tzafon V'Darom. These are the 10 Sefirot according to the Sefer Yetzira, and this is the first source which mentions the word 10 Sefirot. Of course, the Sefer Yetzira has been known in Judaism long before the 10 Sefirot, as Kabbalah understands them, was known, and it was understood generally to mean numbers or something like that. The Mekbalim are the first ones to, maybe the Sefer HaBoyer or others, are the Zohar, understand this to mean some sort of attributes of God or some sort of emanations from God. Exactly how to understand that is the subject of further shiurim in this book, and they have read all of that into this book or out of this book. But that's the important first source of that Ramak, and as we'll see, the Ramak in the next 6 chapters is going to be reading through these first 2 Mishnayot really. So because to him those are the ones that are describing that there are 10 Sefirot. So the Ramak wants to say, just like he organized his book into different questions, right? That there are 10 Sefirot is the first shot. The second is why there are 10 Sefirot. The third is what are these 10 Sefirot? So if the Keter is counted, so exactly what are their names? The fourth, he talks about what they are made out of, what are they? And to him, these Mishnayot sort of go in this order, or at least that's how he understands it. So the first 2 Mishnayot to him are talking about that there are 10 Sefirot and proving them or explaining how they work, and some partially, but probably mostly about proving them, and that is the 2 Mishnayot. These 2 Mishnayot is what he's going to be working through in the next 6 chapters. Then the next things are things that he explains in later chapters. Okay, I think that was enough for today, and I hope it got us further somewhere.